Drag story hours are events where drag performers read to kids. Earlier this year, Enfield Pride planned to hold its first ever drag story hour at a local library in Enfield, Connecticut. But organizers received threats on social media.
A Pride event in Enfield is now off after organizers say they received social media threats.
The Drag Story Hour was originally supposed to be for children and their families here at the Enfield Library.
An Enfield Pride event that was canceled over social media threats is now back on. Organizers say the Drag Story Hour will be happening in April, but at a new location with added security.
The event finally took place on April 20th. Drag performer Felicity V. Lay read to children and their families at the Connecticut State Assunta Community College Library. One of the books read at the event was The Hips on the Drag Queen Go Swish, Swish, Swish. It's written by Lil Miss Hot Mess. This clip was recorded by CT Insider.
The hips on the drag queen go swish, swish, swish all through the town.
This is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Many people think of libraries as quiet places to study, work, or read a book. But the quiet rooms of libraries have also been centers of social change. This hour, we look at how libraries can help people build community and explore identity. Later, we discuss a librarian who helped start New York's well-known Morgan Library and Museum while keeping her racial identity a secret. But first, the recent Drag Story Hour in Enfield, Connecticut. Lil Miss Hot Mess is a board member with Drag Story Hour. It's a national nonprofit that organizes events similar to the one in Enfield. She's also a children's author and university professor. The recent event in Enfield was not affiliated with the nonprofit Drag Story Hour, but one of Lil Miss Hot Mess's books was read at the event. The Reverend Dr. Greg Gray is president of Enfield Pride and pastor of Enfield United Church of Christ. Welcome both of you to Disrupted.
Thanks so much.
We're glad to be here. Thank you.
I asked Lil Miss Hot Mess about Drag Story Hours and what it is about those events that appeal to her.
For me, it's an exciting way to bring this kind of traditional community art form into new spaces and to new audiences. I think that children and drag queens share a lot of affinities in that we love to dress up, we love to play, we love to sort of stimulate our senses with glitter and patterns and colors and all these sorts of wonderful and curious things. And drag is really an opportunity to sort of open up our imaginations, flex our creativity, and get to play with each other. And I think that that's something that we could all use more of in today's world.
Greg, I want to bring you in here because as I was listening to that description, I was realizing that sadly, everything seems so heavy and contentious, and it doesn't seem like there are spaces for connection, for play, for imagination, and just wonder. And yet your organization, Enfield Pride, seems really dedicated to carving out those spaces of community and connection where people can just simply be. Tell us more about Enfield Pride and your role in that organization.
Well, I have now been in Enfield for 4 full years. I started in my 5th year in Enfield. I'm originally from Georgia. That's why I talk funny. But when I got to Enfield, I found that there was a substantial queer population. There was just not much communication, right? And so Enfield Pride was born with the idea of creating community advocacy and visibility so that we can create queer space in Enfield, Connecticut. And it is so needed. Enfield, Connecticut is not much different from where I grew up in Georgia. It is rural. It's a very purple kind of community that the government of the town has switched back and forth over the years between Democrat and Republican. And so there's people of kind of all stripes that are in there, kind of halfway between Hartford and Springfield on the 91 corridor. And so there are people in the town that are growing up that have to drive to a city to really find queer space, queer community. And I want to make certain that there is a generation of children that are growing up in Enfield, Connecticut, that know that their hometown has queer space in it where they can be loved and appreciated and celebrated.
I think, Greg, that importance of space cannot be overstated. Like you, I grew up in the South and I moved to Connecticut and thought, oh, it's going to be so different. And it's why I now refer to it in some ways as up South, right? Because of those same traditions. Talk to me more about that idea of creating visibility and space, particularly for young people. Let's be clear, being a young person is hard in any way that you are. But when you're a young person who is rendered invisible, who feels that your worth is overlooked because of who you are, that space can become even more important. How does creating those spaces like a drag story hour in Enfield help you make that connection to say, we see you and we support you?
So I'll tell a story from my history, and I am now an aging millennial gay. So the stories that I have from my growing up are not the stories that our queer kids have today, right? That I have to tell the history of the queer community in some ways. So I remember the first time that I snuck into a queer bar in Atlanta underage and walked into that space. And, putting it in terms of my day job, it was a sacred moment. It was an absolutely sacred moment where I walked into this club and there were other queer people. And I had this overwhelming feeling of, I am not alone. I am not alone. Because growing up in Monroe, Georgia, which is out in the middle of God's nowhere, right? That I, at many points in time, thought that I was the only queer person in the world.
The finer point that I want to make here is that there is no singular queer experience. And so that's why we need more stories, more books, different perspectives, because we break down that monolithic view and it allows people to be seen in all the manifestations of their experience. The way that that happens is when we have authors like Little Miss Hot Mess writing those stories and providing access for people to not just see their queer experiences, but for others to learn empathy and connection as well. One of those books that was read at the Enfield event was written by Little Miss Hot Mess. That book is called The Hips on the Drag Queen Go Swish, Swish, Swish. Tell us about your book and how it came to be.
Well, The Hips on the Drag Queen Go Swish, Swish, Swish is a play on the Wheels on the Bus, and it takes kids and families through many of the things that drag queens do in the world. So our hips go swish, 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 our hair goes up, 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 our shoes go stomp, 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 and our dance goes twirl, 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 et cetera, et cetera. And the book really began as a song that I was singing with kids at Drag Story Hour events, because at the time, almost 10 years ago, there weren't really that many children's books that dealt with LGBTQ themes, and that thankfully has exploded over the past 10 years. But we wanted a way to help explain to kids who drag performers are, and also to give them a chance to take some of the magic home with them, or for kids in areas where we don't have drag story hours to be able to explore that, on their own and with their parents and families. And I think what's important for me in the book is that it's a song. Kids can dance along. It sort of teaches them some of the, not just what drag queens do, but some of the aesthetics of drag, right? Drag is often about taking elements of pop culture, songs, characters, celebrities, and giving them a little bit of a queer twist. And so one of the things that I wanted to do was to offer kids that experience in an age appropriate way. And so rather than, telling kids a drag queen is, XYZ, it encourages them to sort of explore that and to see, what does it feel like to swish my hips? What does it feel like to stomp down a runway? What does it feel like to twirl around? And, not all those things might be for every kid, but I think opening up that kind of menu of possibilities helps them better understand who they are and who they can be in this world.
I'm curious how writing these books, providing opportunities for other young people to feel seen, what has that taught you about yourself? What have you learned about, who you are by creating these opportunities for other people to see themselves?
That's such a good, deep question. And, I think in writing the books and in hosting story hours, I often do feel like there's a bit of healing for my own sort of, inner or past queer child. I'm also of an elder millennial generation that grew up under very different circumstances. And so getting to sort of see myself reflected in some ways in these children's faces and to watch their excitement and their joy in the spaces really allows me to sort of go back and sort of imagine those experiences that I didn't necessarily get to have. And I will say, I think one of the biggest, gifts as an author is getting to see kids interact with these books, whether it's at Drag Story Hour events or, the messages and photos that children's parents send me and being told that, they had to read it 3 times before they went to bed and it's their new favorite book and they can't put it down. And just knowing that kids, respond and take up this work is really just so heartwarming.
That was Lil Miss Hot Mess, a children's author and board member with Drag Story Hour. You also heard from the Reverend Dr. Greg Gray, president of Enfield Pride and pastor of Enfield United Church of Christ. Coming up, more with Lil Miss Hot Mess and the Reverend Dr. Greg Gray. They'll discuss the attacks on drag story hours in Connecticut and beyond. And later, we learn about Belle DaCosta Green, a librarian who shaped New York's Morgan Library. This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Today we're talking about libraries as spaces for community and cultural change. Drag story hours are events where drag performers read to kids. They've popped up at libraries across the country, including right here in Connecticut. Today we'll hear about a recent drag story hour in Enfield. Still with us is Lil Miss Hot Mess, a board member with Drag Story Hour. It's a national nonprofit that organizes these events, though not the one in Enfield. She's also a children's author and university professor. We're also joined by the Reverend Dr. Greg Gray, president of Enfield Pride and pastor of Enfield United Church of Christ. Greg explains how the Enfield event was canceled and rescheduled.
So we had originally scheduled the event. We started advertising the event, I believe, as early as January. And it was originally scheduled to be at the Enfield Public Library. Now, I went through all of the proper channels. I filled out all of the forms for the town and got approval. And I reserved the space, the community room at the Enfield Public Library. So as soon as I posted the event and started advertising, within 24 hours, we got significant pushback, significant pushback to the event. And, I want everyone to know that we get that same kind of pushback for every one of our Enfield Pride events. The difference is that kids were involved. And I believe that if you want to come to our Enfield Pride celebration that will be on June 15th, you are welcome to. And you as an adult get to make that choice for yourself. But I do not want to put kids in harm's way. And so with the messages that we were receiving from the individuals that we were receiving them from, we decided that it was out of an abundance of caution that we were going to cancel the event. Within the next couple of days, I got a message from a person that I had never met. Her name is Erica, and she was the librarian at CT State as Nuntuck. CT State as Nuntuck is the community college that is in Enfield, Connecticut. And so she reached out to me and said, "Hi, Greg, you don't know me. This is me and my job. We would love to host you here at the college for the Drag Story Hour."
I'm going to ask you a question, Little Miss Hot Mess, because you have been part of these story hours for so long. And it seems to me that the backlash is reaching a fever pitch that is corrosive, divisive, and dangerous in so many ways, not just for organizations like Enfield Pride who want to host these events, but for people who are saying, why do you want to resist me so much? What do you think is at the root of that real resistance and real opposition to not hosting story hours?
Yeah, it's such a complex equation, and I think there's a number of things sort of at the root. I think, on the one hand, it's kind of just our traditional homophobia, transphobia, sexism, racism, all the sort of isms that unfortunately have and still plague our society. I think it's also kind of part of a cynical right-wing tactic to rile its base by, creating, fabricating these culture wars and, making it seem like this is some absurd agenda that it isn't. And I think it's also a bit of an attack on imagination and play and creativity, as I was talking about before. Sometimes when I talk about this, people say, well, sure, but it's really a distraction. This is distracting from the real issues. And I always push back on that a little bit because I think it's important to remember that creativity and imagination and play are important cultural and political tools, right? And the right and this kind of rising wave of authoritarianism that we're facing in our country really relies on people not thinking critically, not thinking creatively, not being able to imagine a better future for themselves. And so even though, that isn't necessarily the mission of Drag Story Hour, I think their attacks on us are rooted in a desire to, keep people quiet, keep people complacent, keep people afraid.
It really is the homophobia, the transphobia that is at the basis of all of it. Because between the church and Enfield Pride, we have held events targeting adults, targeting children, intergenerational events, and we have held them at different locations. We hold many of them at the church. We have now held some of them on town property and state property. And the common denominator for all of them is the pushback, the transphobia, right? That, okay, well, you don't want us to hold an event on town property because you don't want your tax dollars to pay for it. Fine, we'll hold it at the church, which is private property. But it's still wrong, right? Well, it's wrong because, you're now holding it in the house of God, and the house of God is not intended for a drag show. Well, let me tell y'all that on Sunday morning, I wear the prettiest dress in worship every Sunday, and it costs a lot of money. And you know what? Every other priest in town does too. So I had a professor in a Candler School of Theology at Emory University, and on the first day of public worship class, he said, "Worship is drama." And you know what? It is. So we get the pushback in the church too. So the church is wrong. The town property is wrong. It's wrong for us to have events for kids. It's wrong for us now. We're going to have a happy hour at the local brewery. Well, that's wrong too because there's alcohol involved. No. The common denominator is the homophobia, the transphobia, that all of the other stuff that why people say that we can't hold these events, the common denominator is the same.
I also think that there is a common path forward where people can say, enough. You don't get to define me. I will claim my power in ways that are extraordinary, ways that are mundane, but I will claim my power. One of the ways that that's going to happen is we are in an election year, which is bringing out so many different factions and concerns that at the end of the day, much of what you two have talked about are coming forward. What do you say to people who are listening to this conversation, whether it is a young person who is seeking to be seen and understood, or an elder in the community who's saying, finally, someone can talk about what I've experienced? What do you say to people who are trying to figure out, how do I affirm my power in a space that seems so set on denying it? What do you say to people?
I really look to the history of drag as an art form for my inspiration. And I say that not because I think everyone needs to become a drag performer in order to find their power, but to look to us for a little bit of inspiration. Drag is not only entertainment, it's not only story hours, it really is a form of community building and self-expression, whether that is sort of creating a new world in the space of a drag performance for just one song, whether that is, performances that have been used to lift people's spirits during dark times like the height of the HIV and AIDS epidemic in this country, whether that is leading a pride parade or a protest march, whether that is even running for political office. There are drag performers who have run for everything from city council up to president. And so I think really looking towards drag's, kind of time-tested traditions of taking something that isn't working for you and isn't working for your community and finding a way to transform it is sort of the core of what we're trying to do here politically as well. And so I think, do it and make it look and feel as fabulous as you can is really the drag way.
Actually, I think I need that on a t-shirt so that I can remind myself every day. Greg, what do you say to people about how they affirm their power in the face of resistance and push forward? What are your thoughts?
I think that is the reason why Enfield Pride is so important in building community, right? That we talk about visibility and advocacy, those two things are important, but community is the one that is the most important, right? That we have to be grounded in a support system that is going to then lend itself to advocacy. It is hard to find your power, to find your voice, to be an advocate when you're out there all by yourself. And so whenever we build that community where we can come back together and say, draw deep from that well of support and love and grace that says, you are loved, you are valid, your experiences in this world as you move through this world in your body, they matter. Then those people who are grounded in that community, who are filled with that grace, then get to go out and stand in the face of protesters whenever they come, and say, nope, this is my space. I'm claiming it. I'm claiming it for myself and the queer community. Here I stake my flag, and I'm going to build the beloved community in the face of everything that stands in front of me.
I really appreciate how both of you are building community. You are affirming the power that we have and the need to use it and not allow others to make us afraid to embrace it. The Reverend Dr. Greg Gray is president of Enfield Pride and pastor of Enfield United Church of Christ. Little Miss Hot Mess is board member with Drag Story Hour. She's a children's author and university professor. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up, we'll learn about a librarian who helped build one of the most well-known library collections in the United States. This is Disrupted. Stay with us. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about libraries and how they can disrupt the status quo. The Morgan Library Museum is a cultural institution in New York City. Its collection includes objects that date back as far as 6,000 years. from Renaissance paintings to the original manuscript of A Christmas Carol. After working as a private librarian to J. Pierpont Morgan and his son, Belle DaCosta Green became the first director of the Morgan Library and Museum when it became a public institution in 1924. She worked at the Morgan until 1948, just 2 years before her death. She helped turn the collection into what it is today, and she was also a Black woman who spent much of her life passing as white. Later this year, the Morgan Library will host an exhibition about Green's career. It's titled Belle DaCosta Green, A Librarian's Legacy. To learn more about Green, we're joined now by Erica Chilela, Exhibition Project Curator at the Morgan Library. Erica, welcome to Disrupted.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm excited to learn so much about what you're doing and the people and lives that you are lifting up in that work, because I think it is a testament to how often we overlook the people who make greatness possible. And so before we talk about, the woman who is really at the center of that work, I want our listeners to know this year will mark the 100th anniversary of the Morgan Library as a public institution, and you are playing a critical role not just in honoring that anniversary, but making sure people see and understand what it takes to get to that milestone. In your view, in your experience, what is it that makes the Morgan Library so exceptional and special?
There are so many things that are really just amazing about the Morgan, but it really is the collection. But how that collection came together, it really started as like one man's, personal interests, but over the 100, even before we went public, but especially since then, it's really been about, collecting the creative process and how we as human beings interact with words and use that to tell stories, to tell histories, to share lives. And it really is an exceptional collection of moments in time from some of the greatest minds throughout history, and not just from only in America or only in England. It really is from throughout the world and out the ages. And I think that's really unique, and being able to have, we have amazing exhibitions where people can come explore that, but then to allow researchers to come and really get hands-on and really explore, and then the projects they create out of that work that continue on the creative process, I think is just really a testament to culture and what we do as human beings.
So the man that you are mentioning there at the center of the Morgan Library, of creating and thinking about how you can curate in a way that exists in perpetuity, is of course J. Pierpont Morgan, legendary businessman, financier, and really a world traveler who wanted to bring those worlds together. Morgan's name is well known. His legacy and lineage are well known. But a person that needs to be more well known, because there really would be no Morgan today without her, is a woman named Belle DaCosta Green. Tell us, who is Belle DaCosta Green?
Belle DaCosta Green is one of my favorite people in the whole wide world now. But she was Pierpont Morgan's librarian when he first decided to, create a home for his budding huge collection. He knew he needed someone to take care of it. And so he hired Belle to come and work with his collection. Almost immediately, she knew this collection was huge. She was a librarian through and through, and was like, hey, nope, we're going to hire a second librarian, which is one of the things I adore about her, because she supported librarianship so much, and those coming up in the field. And she immediately saw this collection, cataloged it, and was like, this is going to be amazing. One of our favorite quotes that we always say at the Morgan is that very quickly in her career, she had decided that she wanted to make the library preeminent. And this was before, this was not, I think she said that around 1907, 1908. So no concept of us ever being a public institution. And she saw the worth of this collection. And she went from just simply cataloging it to gaining Morgan's trust and starting to acquire for him and building the collection as we know it today. And then in 1924, what we're celebrating this year, when we became a public institution, she became its first director and moved from just being a librarian to a cultural heritage leader, um, at a time when women did not hold these positions.
To have a woman emerge as this cultural heritage leader in those times in the United States, in New York, is exceptional and trailblazing. But Belle DeCosta Green had a particular experience that made it even more groundbreaking as a woman who spent most of her life passing for white, and all of the dangers that I think people take for granted of the risk of doing that. What was her experience or background that led her to this, being able to influence so much? But what was it about that background and experience that you think shaped her approach to the library?
Yeah, so I mean, her background, I mean, I always say that, like, I don't know how she did what she did with the strength that she did at the time that she did, being a Black woman and hiding that. I think is just got to take a strength that today we just don't understand. But I mean, and I think that strength really came from her mother, Genevieve. So Green really was raised by her mother, Genevieve Fleet Greener, who was the wife of the famous Richard T. Greener, who was the first African American to graduate from Harvard. But she herself was a teacher and a musician. And between the two of them, really educated their children into this is how, the importance of education, the importance of learning, but also were part of an elite Black society in Washington, D.C. And so Green was really well versed in proper etiquette, and this is how we act in certain situations. And so by the time she gets to Morgan, she has been reared by this woman who didn't ever take no for an answer herself. It was actually Genevieve who made the decision for the family to pass as white. She is the first in the family we know to change her name. And Green just runs with it and is like, my mother is a strong woman who learned how to survive in a country that didn't want her to survive, a country that said, oh, because of the color of your skin, you are not entitled to privileges. You are not entitled to get an education. You're not entitled to get this work. And of course, like so many African Americans just said, you're crazy and we're going to do us because we're amazing. And I think she really just took that and ran with it. And we see the accomplishment. But there's also that very real of what could their life have been like had she not had to hide so much of herself. But in many ways, I always say that the one thing I hope people get from this exhibition as they learn about her life, coming from this Black community, passing to white, is that while we don't, she did have to hide that part of herself, she very much told us who she was. And that was a librarian. That was someone who supported knowledge and was not willing to be pushed down by societal conforms at this time that said, this is what a woman does. This is what the African American community should do. She really was like, no, I'm going to be me and I'm going to do it to my fullest, regardless of what anybody else. And I really think that came from her mother.
I think, Erica, some people may be surprised to hear you say that it took a certain type of bravery to make that decision, to realize the conditions, to calculate the risk and say this will be an act of survival. But also, by making that choice, Belle, in some ways, was able to tell these stories, create something that would live in perpetuity and represent the fullness, not just of her experience, but that of others, and do it in a way that I wonder if she was openly known or seen as a Black woman, would she have been able to do that? And I think it speaks to the power of this collection and this library to tell the fullness and the richness of people's experiences. And that Belle DeCosta Green was at the core of that is even more amazing. What are one or two items that you are most excited about in this upcoming exhibition, or that to you really speak to the beauty and essence of this history?
Oh, so I always go with one of my favorite things is actually her very last acquisition she ever made. as director of the Morgan, and that was the Zirganella Gospels, which is a medieval manuscript from Ethiopia that dates around the 13th century. But what's really amazing about this acquisition is that it is a work that was commissioned by a princess from Ethiopia, Zirganella, whose grandfather was actually seen as being the first real head of the Ethiopian nation. And when she created this work, she actually put in what is known as canon tables that were dated earlier from her in order to preserve her family's legacy and to show her family's belief in culture, and that it was literature and art that uplift a people. And I think there's something to be said that this is Green's very last acquisition. It's from a work that was commissioned by a woman, by an African woman who believed in preserving a legacy. And she had been looking for this manuscript. She had been like interested in buying it for over 10 years when she finally acquires it. So there is, at the end of her career, was she thinking about her own legacy? Was she thinking about the legacy as it was, how it could have been? I mean, there's all these questions that we don't have answers to. She doesn't really explain why she buys it, except that, she really believed in collecting non-Western materials, which is, again, is a testament to her. But the fact that this is her last acquisition, and is just really, and kind of once you learn that history behind the creation of that manuscript, it really becomes a powerful thought process of thinking about her legacy at the Morgan. One of the other things it's not one object, it's multiple objects, but we really highlight her relationship with women scholars and other women librarians she worked with, and really her role as a mentor and a teacher that I don't think people really understand, is that she really believed in these books should not just sit on a shelf, that they are meant to be used. And I mean, there's this great newspaper article we're going to have in the show where like the New York Times is like, oh my God, Belle Green is using medieval manuscripts as textbooks. How, like, oh my goodness. And it's just like, well, of course she did, because she believed they had so much to teach and that you should be using them, you should be touching them. And I think it was really a forward thinking on access that, we in librarianship today is at the core of everything we do. And here we are in the 30s and 40s thinking about it and talking about it. And it's really amazing when you see what she did for that and just her support of women and women scholars and really uplifting their work. I think is really incredible. And we have multiple objects in the show that highlight those connections.
I want to dig in there because I think we now take for granted the purpose, the function, and the possibility of libraries. We so much think now of libraries as public access, open access, ways for people to touch, to learn, and to connect. But that wasn't necessarily the case, as you mentioned, in those early days. The fact that the Morgan existed, but it wasn't until 1924 that it became a public institution. Why was that notion of access and, knowledge for whom so critical to how she saw her role in that, but also how she saw the possibility of the Morgan?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, especially like places like the Morgan were considered, special collections. So we're always going to be different than an institution. I mean, right down the block from us is the main hub of the NYPL branch of the New York Public Library. And so no, we're never going to be a collection where you can go in and take a book out and bring it home. But back in Green's time, especially when we go public, we're one of the first major private collections that becomes a public institution. And over the next 10 years after we go public, you'll see a number of these collections that are held by wealthy, prominent businessmen become public institutions. But there were a lot of those institutions that grappled with what does going public mean. And when we went public, we were incorporated as an educational institution. So we had to do certain things to make sure we were giving back to New York City. And that included, that's when we started our major exhibition programs. But Green really took that as a next step of no, I want to do lecture series. The network she created from buying all our acquisitions let her meet so many different professors and scholars in the field. And she invited them all to give amazing lecture series. So the Morgan became a classroom. Which is really kind of unheard of at this time. You know, she has this really great quote one time where she's asking somebody to give a lecture, and she's like, we're not, you know, all high and mighty here. We just want a simple lecture. She really wanted the general person to be able to come in and access that same information, which I think was really new at that time, of not being, you know, thinking not as this elite, like, oh, only these certain people, you know, who have this certain education. She really wanted anyone who wanted to be able to access that. And, you know, one of my favorite letters I found in the archive was when she's writing to another institution who's asking to borrow a manuscript for a researcher. And she says, no, I'm not going to send you the manuscript. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make you a copy, or a facsimile, which is essentially a copy that almost looks like the real thing, and say, I'm going to send you that, but don't give it to the researcher. I want you to keep it in your library. So that way, when the researcher's done, the next researcher has access to it. And she starts sending out all of these facsimiles to institutions around the world, because for her, what she said is no student should have to travel east or west and incur the cost of travel to do this work. And so she's already thinking about the cost of research travel. And it's like, almost, I was blown away by that, because, you know, it's something we think about today. We're just like, you know, we'll call an institution and be like, hey, can you digitize this for me? But that was digitization in the 30s. And she really believed that everyone should have access, regardless of where they are, regardless of their money they had. I mean, this really is a class issue. And she was very aware of it. And, you know, we have to wonder, even though she did come from a fairly good background, I mean, there were many times her family struggled with money. And so was that in the back of her mind? And so it really, I mean, it's just a lot of forward thinking. She was very pioneering in these ways that, you know, very quickly, a lot of these other institutions started to pick up on, and they worked kind of together. There's amazing letters where she's writing, like, what do you think about this access policy? And she'd be like, oh, this library is too restrictive. We're not going to be like that. We're going to be like this. And you kind of see how the whole field of special collections and these private collections turned public were really developing. And she was at the forefront of that.
I'm curious how doing this work, what has it taught you about yourself? What, through this experience of exploring Belle DeCosta Green, what has Erica learned about who she is?
Oh, that I wish I could be just as defiant as she was. I mean, I do not have the strength that she does. I'm not as vocal as she was, which I wish I could be. But I think what I really take from her that I've learned about myself is that you, in order to do this work, you need to be passionate. You need to care. And I've always believed in, you know, my heart, in my heart, I am a storyteller, and and I want to tell people stories that are often so overlooked and neglected. I mean, it's one of my favorite things to do is to share, you know, this kind of work. And I think through her, I've realized just how important that is, and why it's so necessary to continue to tell these stories. Because I mean, I've gotten to meet with a number of students who come in and, you know, are researching Green, and to have one-on-one sessions with them and to be able to support them and see where they're going to go next in the same way Green did in her day, and realizing, like you said, like, I am a part of that legacy. And then who knows what that student I met with, what will they accomplish next? And I realized that, you know, it's hard sometimes being in this field. I mean, museums, library, archives is a very not always fun field to be in. You have to have a passion for it. And especially as a woman of color, there aren't as many of us as there should be in it. And so, like, to really know that it's important to continue to do the work, no matter how hard it might get, which I think, you know, Green epitomized. I mean, there were plenty of times where she, you know, writes amazing letters where she's like, I'm just going to leave for Europe and just like sit all day reading. And then, of course, she didn't do that. I mean, when she retired in 1948, she passes away in 1950. She doesn't live that long after her retirement, unfortunately, because she gets sick. But like every day, despite any difficulties, she was happy to come in and do this work, and it really filled her. And I think it's important to sometimes remind yourself why you're doing what you're doing. And so any day I struggle, I'm just like, nope. Like that's when I'll like, let me go look at one of her favorite acquisitions, or let me read a letter and really remember that the work we're doing has a purpose.
The work you're doing has a purpose, and it also has power. And I'm thinking about where we are in the United States right now, where there seems to be such resistance to learning, such resistance to the difficult pieces of our history and our collective experiences, whether it is efforts to ban books or efforts to suppress learning, because of the power of what I think how learning can lead to liberation and freedom for people. What do you say to budding librarians, curators, those who are interested in telling these stories and don't always see themselves as a part of that? The same way that Belle DeCosta Green did not always see herself, or, that others may not. What do you say to those who are interested but doubting whether there's a place for them?
Find someone to talk to, because we need to be there. They need to be there. And it can feel very lonely, but it's important to remember that, like Belle Green, there were moments where she felt like that. Throughout this process, we've also researched contemporaries of hers, but that were Black librarians within the Black community, and what struggles did they face? And they also had moments that were also deeply lonely, and you had to push through. And I mean, I think that's something we always all kind of feel. It's a part of being who we are and in this world. And I think it's just remembering that without those who are willing to push through, we don't move forward. But it's also important to remember that doesn't, take time for yourself. Take those moments of joy. I mean, Belle Green loved to go to the opera, and she did. She enjoyed a good, drink. She had tea parties with people. She made, she had the circle of friends that when she needed those moments to step away, she could. And I think having that core and understanding what you need to do to mentally recharge yourself is so important in order to continue. Because we do need to continue, because we cannot let books get banned. We cannot let our histories not be told. Because, and it's really funny, because I just yesterday read a quote from Green's father, Richard T. Greener, who had written to Booker T. Washington that in order for African Americans to really understand themselves and to see themselves, they need to know and study their past and know where they come from. And to me, that's still, that is the heart. We need to know where we've been to know where to go. And that's in all of the aspects of our lives. And I think Green saw that, regardless of how she shared that with the world, from a race perspective. But I think she knew that, and in a way was doing that. And all we can do is continue to do that. And even if it's in the smallest little things, if somebody listens to this and shares it with the next person, that's how you do it. If you're a librarian or curator or whatever, who's like, where do I go next? I mean, make those communities learn, reach out to me, reach out to anybody, your professors, and just say, what do I do? How do I make sure that we continue this work? And, I hate to say it's going to be hard, but, we just got to keep persevering through. It's important that we do it.
Erica Chilela is Exhibition Project Curator at the Morgan Library. Thank you, Erica.
Thank you so much.
Disrupted is produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Wayne Edwards, Meg Dalton, and Katie Tularski. You can listen to all the previous episodes of Disrupted by finding us wherever you get your podcast. I'm Kalila Brown Dean. Thanks for listening.